Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Tech Done Different. I'm your host, Ted Harrington, and with me today is my special guest, Rich Schnitzel. Rich, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Rich, one of the things that we're going to talk about today that I was really interested in having you join us was to really talk about automation and kind of how, even what it is and how we should be thinking about it. You're certainly the expert in this. But before we get into automation, I really wanted to explore this idea that you've shared with me before. And maybe in the context of answering this question, you could also just introduce yourself for our audience and kind of tell them why you're awesome. But you and I were talking the other day about this idea of how everybody in technology is always looking to like push things to the edge. They want the biggest or the best or the fastest or the most efficient or whatever. And you kind of have a different take on that. So let me start with that as a question. Explain that to me. You know, what is the different take that you have? And yeah, of course, let our audience know kind of who you are.
Yeah, so I'm Rich Schnitzel. I run a done-for-you automation business where I help people understand what it is that they're doing in their business and how we can use tech to improve the efficiency and the efficacy of what their workflows are so that they have the opportunity to scale. And in that conversation, as you said, the natural tendency of people in tech and frankly for engineers is we want to be making the coolest, baddest things out there, right? I have this mental image of my head where I am Tony Stark, right? That's my internal persona, and Tony Stark is always doing the coolest things. But to be effective in what I'm doing, I have found that I need to go the exact opposite of that direction, and that's to simplify things and to like almost, if it's possible today, what was I doing 3 months ago, and apply what that looks like to the businesses that I'm working with. And in that, it allows us to do two things for me. One, the opportunities that are available for more normal people to use like just a more straightforward approach is larger, and it allows them the opportunity to understand what's going on. I see a lot of instances where people have this great idea that they saw and then they try to implement it and they just get lost and they get frustrated and then it never happens. And the most important thing that we can do is have something that we use. Right? I love the statement, the best program that you have is the one that you actually use. And I think our tendency to make things super complicated goes directly against that sentiment of, if you don't use it, it's pointless. It's just a cool little thing that we get to put on a shelf somewhere and point at and say, I made that, which, don't get me wrong, is really cool. But if we're talking about trying to help people move the needle forward, it's not as effective as I think we like to think, the people in the industry who understand that really high level thought process.
There's a really interesting element to what you just said that I think the security practitioners in particular in our audience might take away from that. And it's this idea that, sometimes security can be counter to the user experience, or at least that's how it's often perceived. And when that happens, when security of a system becomes too difficult to use, people don't use it, right? They'll circumvent it. And so I think sort of the classic example is when file transfer systems were sort of first invented so that you could securely send something from me to you. And those were really difficult to use at first. And so the result was people said, well, I'm just going to email it. And it totally circumvented the whole security element. So that's really interesting.
The number of passwords that are 1, then 2, then 3, because you're forced to change it every 30 days. Nobody's going to come up with a new password. So what do? They go, oh, okay, it remembers the past 6. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And just add it on the end. I think it's the similar thing of so complicated.
Right.
that people figure out how to break it in a simple fashion.
Yeah. So let's talk about simplicity, because that was definitely one of the things that jumped out to me out of the first, right out the gate of our conversation today. The first things that you were saying was to focus on simplifying. And I'm a big believer in that, that you make a bigger impact, you get more done, the less that you try to do.
Mhm.
And so how did you arrive at your own viewpoint on the benefits of simplifying?
I think it's a little bit that I am into tech out of a hobby, but not out of training. I'm a mechanical engineer by training. And in a lot of mechanical engineering, a simple system is the most effective. Right? We have a theory in engineering where you can over restrain something, where you can put so many points of restraint on some mechanical mechanism that you actually do harm to what you're trying to do. And you need to allow more freedom, and in that freedom, make it simpler. And so I have that viewpoint. And then part of who I am as a person is I share my life with my wife, who is a English theater double major. So non-logical, like complete opposite of the way my brain works is her brain. And I have found the way for me to communicate what I do to her in a way that makes sense to her is to simplify it. And I think it's important to note that simplicity doesn't mean dumbing it down. It just means taking out the complexity. Right? I can have an engineering discussion with her, and I can make her understand how an engine works. But I'm not going to bring in thermodynamics into that conversation. I'm going to take that complexity out, and I'm going to make a relationship between something that she understands in the normal world and how an engine works, and give her that understanding of that process in that simple nature. And I have that type of conversation with business owners all the time. And I started paying attention to what I was talking about with them, and that through line of, okay, we can make something really amazing here that's really complicated. But when I start at the most simplest idea and we just kind of build, we stop at 60% because that's all they needed.
Mm-hmm.
That last 40% I thought was cool, but it didn't move the needle anymore for what they were trying to do.
I love how this discussion of simplifying and simplicity is sort of now expanding into discussion about communication. And you're so spot on about how we need to simplify things, especially complicated technical things, in order to communicate them. I mean, I certainly went through that process writing a book about application security, right? That's like an enormously complex technical topic. And how do you simplify it in a way that like a teenager can understand it? So I like the metaphor that you were alluding to, or maybe I don't think it was a metaphor, but like the actual story. You could explain an engine to your wife. So what I'd like to do is see if we can extract some actual principles for people about how to do this, because this is a real problem in tech. So let's talk about an engine. So how would you describe an engine simply to somebody who does not understand anything about engines?
Okay, so an engine is a energy source in and an energy source out. At the most basic level, we're taking gasoline, we're putting it into a mechanical instrument that is the engine, and it is creating a force that drives our car. The way that we're doing that is burning gasoline. What happens when you burn something? You get heat and you get an expansion of air. If you've seen an explosion, if you've, a little bit of a pyro in you and you've thrown gasoline on a fire, like you've seen that explosion that's happening. That's what's happening in an engine, except in the instance of a fire where it's really big, that's happening at thousands of times per second, right? RPM in a car stands for rotations per minute. So when you see that needle in your car at 6K, your car is turning over 6,000 times a minute. Every time it's turning over, there is a small explosion that's happening that is creating heat, which is why cars get hot, and it's expanding the air, which is moving pistons, which are just it's a cylinder that can expand and contract, and it's taking that motion and through a set of gears turning your wheels.
That's, you know, I've driven cars like since I was able to drive cars, and I would not consider myself a gearhead or engine person or anything, but I did not understand until right this minute. I was today years old when I understood what makes a piston move, and it is the air moving because of the expansion caused by the heat, right? That's what you just said?
Yeah.
Wow. I'm ready to go teach mechanics class now.
There you go. Yeah. Air and fuel, the limiting factor in any engine is actually air. You can dump as much fuel as you want in. If you don't have enough air to create that reaction and expand the atmosphere in the piston, it's worthless. I mean, that's why you get soot out of diesel engines. Is too much fuel, not enough air.
So here are a few things that I observed out of the way you just explained how an engine works. And tell me if this is the right takeaways that we should be trying to extract for our audience here. First thing I noticed was that you simplified it into a formula that had basically 3 parts, right? It was something goes in, there's a part in the middle that does something to that thing, and then it produces something else. And that's how you started, so that the audience could kind of understand the context. So you started at that high level, you kept it really simple to 3 parts. And then you used words that human beings would use to each other about what was happening in that thing in the middle and how that thing in the middle created the outcome. Those were sort of the things that I observed in your communication there. Did I capture those correctly?
Yes, exactly. And I think the most important thing that I did was that very beginning piece was I broke it down into that 3 input system that we can take that and apply it to everything else, right? I can start with that same layout in any other aspect of a conversation that we want to have. I think a lot of what we do incorrectly when we're adding complexity into what we're talking about is we start too far down, right? For me, I hear it all the time when you're talking about a lead funnel. Like everybody starts out with, I got a lead from Facebook. That's too far in, right? You just had a contact with a person, right? In security, it's probably, some error happened. And now I have to figure out, well, don't start with the error. Start with strip away all of the detail in that first statement until it gets so simple that it applies to everything in what you're talking about. And then you have a broad context without the assumptions that I'm applying to it. If I just started out with gasoline and fuel goes into the piston, right? I'm assuming you know what a piston is. I assume you know what fuel is. I assume we're talking about a gasoline engine, right? I've made 5 or 6 different assumptions with that first statement that I shouldn't be making because I have no idea whether or not you're making the same assumption. So I back it out farther.
Yeah, that's a great observation, assumption. So let me ask you about assumptions. The way you're describing it, I'm definitely tracking with you, 100% agreed. The challenge that I could potentially see, and maybe you could give some advice for how to deal with this, is how does someone identify those assumptions? Because that's one of the challenges. Definitely, it doesn't even matter if you're in security or tech or corporate. It doesn't matter what context you're talking about. People are used to communicating at a certain level, and there's some assumptions already baked into that. And your advice is to reject those assumptions. Like, don't assume that person knows what you're saying in order to make it simple. How does one do that when they're immersed in those assumptions every day?
The best prompt I can provide is pretend you're trying to describe this to a 5-year-old. And the reason why is a 5-year-old has this amazing tendency to go, but why? Right? They could but why you to death. Like, it doesn't matter how intelligent or correct your response is, they can still go, but why? And it can still be a valid statement. So it's what I use when I'm trying to think through something. Okay, here's my statement, but why? But why is that a true statement? And that but why forces you to go, well, it's true because I know this. Okay, that was an assumption. And then just repeat that cycle. But why? But why do I know this is true? And that question will pull out the assumptions that you're making about the circumstances around your conversation.
Yeah. So some people hearing that type of advice, I've certainly come across this when I make a similar recommendation about, try to explain it to a curious kid or whatever. People sometimes feel like, will I be insulting this person? Because I think what a lot of people hear when they hear that statement is treat this person as if they are only as smart as a 5-year-old. But that's not what you're saying. What you're saying is explain it so that a 5-year-old can understand it. And thus a 45-year-old will definitely understand it. But how do we deal with that sort of ego that might get in the way?
In my experience, it has less to do with the person's ego that you're doing the explanation to, and more to do with your own ego of and ego that you think it's too simple. So you don't want to feel like you don't understand what's going on, right? I've struggled with it as being an engineer and doing what I do. Like, for me, complicated things are way simpler to me than they are to my clients. But if I explain something really simple, they're still going to get a lot of value out of it. It's simple to me, it's not to everybody else. And I have struggled with putting something out there that I think is simple and isn't worthy of like who I am. I feel like it diminishes me, and I've had to work through that and go, okay, this has nothing to do with my value. This is just effective communication. I think, and I've done it, you kind of go, okay, I don't want to offend them. Really, I don't want to feel like, they're going to look at me and going, you felt like you need to ask that? How many times have we heard the story about the person in a boardroom that raised their hand and go, I'm sorry, I didn't get that. Can you explain that? And that was the aha moment, right? Nobody wants to say, I don't get that, not because they want to offend the speaker, but because they don't want to feel like the idiot in the room. And I think talking simply sometimes is more about us not wanting to feel like the idiot in the room than it is about wanting to offend the other person.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear you on that. I would agree with that too. And maybe there's even I kind of feel like that sometimes people speak in complexities in order to maybe exclude to a certain extent or to position themselves as smarter than others in the room. I mean, I certainly have interacted with executives before where I'm like, I definitely don't know what this person's saying. And I don't know if this person knows what they're saying. And so how do we identify if we ourselves are doing that? It's easy to identify when someone else is doing it, like, oh, this guy, but when I go into my next meeting with a customer, what should I do to make sure that I'm not falling into that trap?
For me, what I do is I'm really upfront about the fact that I want my clients to interrupt me.
Okay.
Yeah, I have experienced that, I'm an engineer. So if I tell you something, okay, that must be the way that it is, right? I have to be right because I have a degree, I have training. And one of the most important things I can do is say, look, I think I know what I'm talking about. I'm very good at this, but I'm still fallible. So please challenge me on what I'm saying. Please have a dialogue with me that if I say something and you go, that doesn't seem right. very open to the idea that I may be wrong. And setting that up for other people gives them the license to have that interaction with you. It's not I'm paying Rich thousands of dollars to help me out. I just have to nod my head and go, okay, right? That's not the interaction that I'm looking for. So for me to dispel that and to find out when I'm doing it is to always reiterate that I want that feedback. Not once, not twice, keep saying it over and over and over again. Every time I present something to them, hey, I built this, please let me know if I'm off base on this. Hey, I'm thinking this. These are my assumptions. Please let me know if they're wrong. Like, keep pounding that idea home.
I love it. I heard you give 2 specific actionable pieces of advice in what you just said that you sort of preempted the answer to the question I was going to ask, which was, well, what about for powerful executives? We've got people listening to the show who are leaders and inherently people who report to leaders either directly or, through the chain of command, sometimes are intimidated by leaders, and leaders sometimes don't even know it. Or if they do know it, they don't know what to do about it. And they're worried, or maybe they don't even realize that the people reporting to them are probably not going to want to interrupt them out of an irrational fear. And what I heard you say was, here's 2 things you could do. And tell me if I got these right. Tell me if there's others we should talk about. One is to specifically articulate that you're fallible. Say, I don't know everything. You use the word I'm fallible. And I think that's a perfectly succinct way to do it. And the second thing I heard you say was to repeat it. Don't just say it once at the beginning, but instead reinforce it, because those are the ways that you're going to get people to actually speak up. Is that correct? And are there other things that we should think about?
That is absolutely correct. And I think the thing that you can add on to that is when somebody takes you up on that offer, celebrate and use that as an opportunity to say, thank you. I've been asking you guys to do this. Thank you for doing this. Right? Don't try to hide that this happened. Right? If you are truly presenting yourself as fallible and you want this, then you need to also be able to take that next step when it happens, to be able to say, hey, look, here's an example. I'm fallible. This person just called me out on this. We had a great conversation. Here's this amazing outcome that came out of that that's going to benefit everybody. Right? Acknowledge and celebrate that, and then you will start to compound the effect. And I think that's the point where then maybe you don't have to repeat it every time that you have a conversation with people, because you've got the momentum of what you set up in the beginning to help you.
Oh, that's so good, man. Well, it's funny that you're an engineer who specializes in automation, and we've just spent like almost half an hour talking about how to communicate. And I think that in itself is a lesson in thinking differently, right? That we have to realize that it's sometimes not even about the tech itself, but it's about how do we communicate it. And so that was, I learned a lot out of what you just described. So that's great. Thank you for that. So let's switch gears and let's talk about automation, because certainly that's an area of expertise for you. And I think that's an area that a lot of, not just our listeners, but pretty much everybody in tech is trying to figure out, how do I automate things? Because I think we're all realizing, just as human beings, that we only have so much time in the day. And if we do want to make more of an impact, that we need to figure out ways to free time back up. And that's the way I've always thought about automation. So I guess my first question is that a good way to think about automation in terms of it frees time up, or is there a better way to think about automation?
I think it's a good way to start thinking about automation. For me, I have 2 things as a litmus test, which is it improves the efficiency and it improves the efficacy. Efficiency is what you're talking about. Does this get done faster? It's really easy to measure, right? If I automate this thing, it used to take me 15 minutes. Now it takes a minute because it's being automated. But to be good automation, it also needs to improve the thing that it's doing. If I automate this thing and it comes out worse, then I really haven't helped myself at all. I've just created a different problem that I am then going to have to solve. So, and improving the efficacy, the next piece of that is in the automation that I build, I'm always trying to start with a human and end with a human. I don't want somebody or something to go down a rabbit hole of endless automation that is supposed to work but maybe doesn't, and then causes a problem. I want a lead to come in. There's a bunch of automation that pulls in all of the information and notifies my VA to do something. They do it. They put in a little bit more information. They use their brain. They think like a human and do things that an automation can't. Say, okay, I'm done with it. Then a whole bunch of other stuff happens to try and get somebody on a Zoom call or get them to respond to an email, whatever that outcome is supposed to be. When that happens, okay, somebody had a Zoom call. Okay, now it comes to me. Here's the backlog of everything that happened. Instead of having to manually chase down everybody, pull in all that information, it just comes in, somebody looks at it, right? So I'm truncating a process down because I'm taking chunks of simplicity that I can automate, and then I'm leaving that complex part to the human. And that is 80% of what I do for automation. Right? That last 20% is the cool, complex, fun stuff that we do get to do. But if you're trying to start thinking about how to apply this to your work, your life, your business, whatever it is, that's where you need to start.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned there's two things that any sort of automation needs to do. And I'm curious what if you only get part of them? So you described, does it make, what is my notes here? Does it improve efficiency and does it improve efficacy? And the efficacy piece, the way you described it was, does it make I can't remember what word you used, but I'll use the word process. It makes the process better than what it was when I was doing it manually. What if it just makes it no worse? Have you succeeded if it's now more efficient and the effectiveness is the same?
If that was your intention from the beginning, then yes.
Okay.
I think the reason I use efficacy the way that I do is because it leaves it open-ended for you to apply your own definition of what improved efficacy is. Right? If your idea of improved efficacy means that, actually, it's so broad, I'm struggling to come up with an exception of it, right? So I would say that my challenge to you would be, in your explanation, your efficacy improved to you if you think it was successful. It may be 0 or negative to me, but that doesn't matter because it's your automation, it's your process.
That's really fascinating because I hadn't really thought about something that seems so objective and measurable, right? Before it did X, and now does it do some percentage different of X? Mm-hmm. That to me seems indisputable, but what I'm hearing you say is really fascinating, that it might be indisputable to me, Ted Harrington, but that's my definition, and you might have a different definition, and a third person might have a different definition. And that's sort of what you're saying, is that when you set out to set up any sort of automation, you have to determine what is the definition of success. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think it's why the way that we started this conversation was so great to kind of empower and set up, now talking about automation, because you can't define those two things effectively for yourself without having the conversation about simplicity and thinking through a process, right? You can't define what efficacy is unless you can have that conversation and have an understanding of how you're validating your efficacy. Right? Otherwise, somebody like me will say, well, Ted, that's wrong because you're not improving efficacy, it's going down. And you need the understanding to be able to say, well, no, and here's why.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So it seems to me that the beginning of any sort of attempt at automation is going to begin with bedlam, just like a chaotic mess that says, I know these results aren't what I want. I'm seeking this other type of result. And it probably starts, I'm shooting from the hip here, but it probably starts with people describing a lot of problems. And they're probably saying, look, I don't like that it does this. I don't like it does this. I run into this bottleneck. And my hope is to eliminate those so that this other thing can happen. So I guess two questions. One, is that typically how an automation project would begin? And then the second is, what's the process by which we create order out of that chaos?
Yeah, so yes, it always starts with, this is my problem. I need to solve this. Can you help? Right. And that's great because it's a starting point for our conversation. So we start there, and then to get through that, you need to be talking with somebody else, like me, because I am going to create a different path through what you're describing than what you have. And by creating that different path, we can start throwing out the superfluous information. I call it, if you're driving down the highway to work and then all of a sudden there's construction and now you're on a detour. When people come to me, they're talking about fixing their detour. I'm going to come in and go, well, why don't you take the highway? Oh, well, because of this. Okay, why don't we fix this so we get back to the highway? What we do naturally as companies grow and problems come up and workflows get created and then change is we add a bunch of stuff that's tacked onto it. And as you start talking with somebody else about what's going on, you start to recognize what's been tacked on it and you can start pulling it off. And then you find the true root of what you're doing. And to be frank, it doesn't have to be me. It just has to be another person. It just has to be somebody else to have that back and forth with.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir. As a security consultant who preaches the idea that companies need to talk to outside experts in order to understand where their blind spots are and the assumptions that they're making that might be broken. I'm fully in support of what you're saying, and I think it's pretty much the exact same principle. And I love this metaphor that you just described, because to me it's so vivid, right? You're trying to get to work and the detour is annoying and you're like, let's fix the detour. And the question is, well, you're trying to get to work. Let's not focus on the detour. If we come back to that if we need to. That's really, really amazing. So how this is me trying to understand how to even be a better security consultant. How do you, as someone who enters a situation, doesn't necessarily understand what getting to work looks like, you're immediately presented with the detour, but you don't yet know it's the detour. How do you separate all of those things out to get to the heart of what matters? It's easy in theory to say, like, let's talk bigger picture, but like, how do we do that?
The easiest way that I found is working backwards. So working with, okay, I know we want to get to work. That's really hard, isn't going to change, easy place to go. And then you as a security expert will have an intrinsic understanding of where the start place should be because you are the expert. And then for me, it's a maze that starts out like a branching tree that I then start asking questions to eliminate branches. Hey, I heard you, talk about how you email your VA 4 times now. Why are you emailing her? Right. I heard that you have to get on a Zoom call with your client before you'll even send them a quote. Why? Right. You're having a problem with people remembering their passwords, right? Why? Whatever that question is that you can ask that will then tell your brain, oh, okay, there were 5 options over here. They said this, so those don't apply. There are a couple options over here. They said this, so those don't apply. And then as that comes tighter and tighter of this web, reevaluate your decisions by just confirming, like, okay, I think I got this figured out now. Tell me if I'm wrong. You're doing this, you want to get here, you're doing this because of this. How am I doing? Okay, cool. And then you can kind of like almost like a save state. Okay, that's done. Now let's open it up. For me, it's a little bit about the process, the idea of task saturation, which is the idea that mind can be doing so many things that I can say, hey, what's your name? And you're going to put your finger up and say, hold on 1 second. Because you're trying to process so many things at the same time. So finding that through path when you don't know what it is and you're trying to discover it is an intentional management of task saturation for my brain, and figuring out a piece and like secluding it out so that I can focus on something else. And I don't reach that point where I have to go, hold on, what's your name? Hold on, I got to fix this. I can finish this thought and then I'll get back to you.
Oh, you are pushing the button that is one of my biggest pet peeves, and it's people's belief that they can multitask, and it is a falsehood. Human beings do not multitask. You just solo task in little micro increments. But I wanted to, that's a bunny trail we could go down for a while. I wanted to go down a different one as our time's running out here, which is, can you answer this question for me? Is machine learning and is artificial intelligence, are these ideas automation? Why or why not?
I think in their current instance, the way that they are now, I don't consider them an automation. I consider them like a nut that you would have put into a system of automation. The idea of machine learning and AI needs to get better before I would consider that an automation. Right now, it's like using JavaScript to automate something. Right? It's a tool, it's a component of it, but automation is what you do with it. Machine learning and AI is an idea that we use to create an outcome. And for that reason, it's not what I consider automation.
Yeah, I asked this question, which I know was a difficult one. I don't know what the right answer is, and I'm with you on I'm going to go with your answer. So I asked because a lot of people in security right now, and I think in other industries too, but I know security well, so I'll just mention that one. A lot of people in security are really excited about the applications for machine learning and artificial intelligence and how those things might potentially improve either prevention or detection or response of security incidents. And I'm excited about that too. I mean, anything that we can do that will improve it. But I'm a little leery today because, and I like the way you describe it, because to me, they feel like they're ideas that are part of an overall machine. They're not themselves inherently the solution, which is what I've sort of been my opinion so far. And that seems to echo sort of what you're saying, not that automation equals security, but that the way you described it, that it's sort of a means to an end. And I like that. I think that's a cool way to think about it. So as our time comes to a finish here, I'll just ask you, I guess, one last question. You're clearly thinking about how things are evolving and adapting, it seems. So if you were to pull out your crystal ball, what's coming around the corner in the world of automation? What should leaders in technology or leaders in security be thinking about over the next 12 to 24 months in terms of the way automation might change their lives?
I think that the entry bar for automating something is so incredibly low right now. Right? You have a myriad of no-code options that allow people with no tech background to start figuring out how to automate things. I think you take that with the fact that the current world state has required people to look for alternatives to run their business that automation provides, in the next 12 to 24 months, if you don't have some level of automation in your business or aren't actively trying to add it to the way that you operate, I think you're very quickly going to start fighting a losing battle, because it's going to become such a common tool for people to use that if you're shunning it and not using it, you're going to be fighting uphill the entire time.
Those are great insights. Rich Schnitzel, you are the man. Thank you so much for sharing all these ideas. I personally have learned a lot. So thank you for joining us and being on the show today. For the rest of our listeners, if you want to learn more about the podcast or appear as a guest yourself, just go to tedharrington.com/podcast, and we'll catch you next time.